Do you ever find that sometimes you want to display a particular model train without having to build a whole layout? Or maybe that favourite loco has finally run out of steam, but you don't want to send it to the scrapyard. Join me in this video as I show you how I made this custom 00 gauge display for this old Hornby Class 43 high-speed train. Hello everyone, Matt from Model Minutes here, and today I'm showing you how you could also build a custom display for your model trains. So what I've got here is an old Hornby unpowered Class 43 locomotive, which, if my research is led to believe, was originally part of a set with its sister numbered 43002, which housed the motor. As far as I can tell, it dates from around 1979, and this one depicts 43003. Due to its age, it's not exactly the most detailed model. The paint isn't exactly amazing, and it's suffered some damage and scratches over the years. It's not in terrible shape though, and I think it will make a good subject for display. To that end, I've bought this rather attractive display case, and the locomotive fits perfectly inside. But this is a little boring to look at, nor would it be much of a video if I stopped here. So let's see if we can't make it a little more exciting. The first thing I'm going to do is to open up this model, carefully prizing the body away from the chassis. All the main parts seem to be here, and I carefully remove the different components to avoid damaging them. Some areas put up a little bit of a fight though, like the clear plastic in the cab area, but with some care it is possible to do. I even dismantled the bogies so that I could get a look at the wheels. I had hoped that it might be a model that could have the potential to be used on a layout at some point. But I've discovered that the metal parts have suffered from Mazak rot, and sadly the days of this running on a layout may well be behind it. To add insult to injury, that little light bulb doesn't work anymore either. I guess it will end up being a static display model from now on, which isn't a bad fate to be honest. With the model reduced to its constituent parts, I gave them all a wash in warm soapy water to get rid of the years of dirt and grime they had accumulated. When they were dry, I thought I'd update the cab a little. I have this engine driver figure, which would look good inside of here. It will need some alteration to make it fit though. I cut away the bottom half of the figure using a small saw blade, tested the fit, and then carefully removed more plastic as needed. Finally, I reached a point where it looked like he could be sitting in the chair. Now he needs painting, so I temporarily superglued him to a stick to make this easier. This cheap grey spray primer was used as the base layer for the figure, giving him a nice even coat all over. Next up, Tamiya flat flesh was carefully brushed onto his face and hands. Vallejo olive brown was used on his hair at the back of his head. Tamiya flat white was painted onto the shirt under his jacket. Vallejo black and Humbrol blue were mixed together to make a darker blue colour that I thought would be more appropriate for his uniform. This was then carefully painted onto the figure, avoiding all the areas that I previously painted. Next up, this Vallejo black wash was used on the entire figure to bring out those recessed details and add some contrast. I'll leave them to dry and move on to the cab now. Vallejo aluminium was carefully painted onto the moulded controls. I added a small blob of black paint onto the tops of the controls. The Humbrol blue makes a reappearance here, and I used it completely as is to paint the two chairs. And when they were dry, it was time to add the driver. It's a shame he looks so good because he will only barely be visible inside the cab. I used some Revell contactor cement to glue this figure into the correct seat. Now I'm moving on to the light strip at the front. The the black factory applied paint isn't that neat, so I simply touched it up with some more black paint to make it look a little better. Oh, and that moulded windscreen wiper also got picked out in black. Moving on to the bogies, I dry brushed some Vallejo gunmetal onto them, and this should give a slightly more realistic look. I repeated this process on the rest of the underframe boxes on the chassis too. I put some on the roof as well, but this was a bit pointless as I'll weather over the top of this later and it won't really be visible, but at least I know I did it. Humbrol natural wood colour paint was loaded into my airbrush, having been thinned with some water. I airbrushed this on all the chassis parts, spraying only from the bottom of the model upwards. This is to depict accumulated dirt and grime as it runs over the railway network. I added thin layers of this paint to make sure I wouldn't overdo the effect that I was looking for. A matte varnish was then sprayed over the top just to make sure it stayed dull and didn't look shiny. That plastic does have a slight sheen to it and I just wanted to get rid of that. Moving on to the body of the locomotive, the black wash was used in the recessed details, particularly around the vents and door handles. This should add some contrast and make it look a bit more three-dimensional. Next, some black paint was mixed with this artist's medium and then thinned so that it would go through the airbrush. The reason I added the medium was to dilute the pigment of the paint without actually making the consistency too thin, otherwise it would pool or run off the model. I sprayed this onto the roof of the model, working vertically down. My aim here is to replicate exhaust staining that I have seen on real life versions of this train. This took quite a while and lots of thin layers to get the effect I was looking for. It's the first time I'd tried airbrush weathering, so I hope it turns out okay. Yeah, I think I've got what I'm looking for, so a layer of clear matte varnish was sprayed over the model. The artist's medium I used earlier has made the weathering a little bit glossy, and I just want to dull this down. When that was dry, this red paint was used to pick out the rear lights on the model. It's time to start reassembling. I started with the bogies. I think these shots show how bad the metal rot is, particularly on the block on the right. The clip at the top has snapped off and you can see these fine little crack lines throughout the whole part. It would be only a matter of time before this would completely disintegrate if it was being used on a layout. I reassembled the bogies and then popped the metal weight back into the main chassis. The bogies were then reattached in the correct places. Although the light bulb is broken, I replaced it anyway. And although they will probably never see electricity again, the wires were clipped into the right places on the bogies. The cab was next to be mounted in place with the wires run underneath to the bulb. The clear window parts are snapped back into their positions. The chassis and body are reunited. Then finally the light strip was pushed into place at the front. And that's my small improvements to the base model now complete. I thought about trying to do something to make those scratches on the body disappear and perhaps tidy up that slightly messy factory applied paint job, but then it dawned on me, at what point would I stop? After all, this is supposed to be showcasing an old model, and if I completely paint over the factory finish, well, it's not really an original Hornby model anymore then. I think it's worth showing off some of the wear and play it's had over the years, because although I don't know the history of this model, I'm sure it brought a number of people a lot of joy over that time, and these are marks that reflect it. Whilst we're talking about history though, I did some research into the real locomotive this model represents, so let's learn a little about the real Class 43 whilst I show some completely unrelated footage in the background. The real HST loco, as represented by Hornby in model form here, was built at Crewe in 1976 and is, by my reckoning, the second production loco ever built, numbered 43003. This followed its sister 43002. It would then have seen service on the Western region until privatisation, which was between 1994 and 1997, where it was then used by First Great Western. Following the introduction of new trains by First Great Western in 2018 and 2019, it was transferred to ScotRail and is still in use in Scotland. However, its sister 43002 is in preservation. Anyways, now that I've finished the model, let's see if I can do something to make the display case a little more exciting. I've cut a thin piece of wood to the same size as the display base, and I will work on this rather than gluing things straight to the plastic base. First up, I found these cork circles in a home shop and thought that they would make a great basing material. Oh yeah, and a bit of track as well, of course. I cut the cork into strips using some scissors, and I'm thinking I'll build a bit of an embankment for the track to sit on. I glued them all down using PVA glue. I then repeated the process to build up a second layer, but this time slightly narrower than before. This old steel track is perfect for this display, so I cut it to the right length using my track cutters. Before I can add the track though, a strip of black card was glued on top of the cork to make sure I had a continuous top layer. General purpose household filler was then spread all over the display base. I'm attempting to make the kind of embankments that railway lines so often run on across the country. When the filler was dry, I gave it a sand to make it a little smoother and remove any lumps that I didn't want. This brown paint was then sprayed over the entire base to get rid of that white. This will form a base for the grass soon. Now though, it's time to glue down that track. I left this overnight to dry so that I could work on it the next day. Humbrol 29 Dark Earth was then brushed onto all the track. This will help to give it a more realistic look and not appear so toy-like. When that was dry, some fine gravel was spread out over the track to look like ballast. It was a bit fiddly trying to stop all these fine grains going in the wrong places. I wet the ballast with isopropyl alcohol, which will help reduce the surface tension for the glue. And speaking of the glue, I'm just using more PVA, but diluted with water and a drop of washing up liquid. It was dropped onto the ballast and left to soak in. A number of repeated applications was needed to make sure it was all eventually completely glued in place. When it was dry, it was time to weather it. I used this umber wash on all the ballast, simply brushing it on to dull down its original colour and make it look as though it suffered some dirt and grime over the use of the track. Next, this black wash was used down the centre of the track. It would seem that the centre of the railway is always a bit dirtier than the edges. With that done, PVA was brushed onto the edges of the track to cover the rest of the base. Some static scatter grass was then applied to this glue. I actually would do 2 applications of this grass, applying more glue later to make the grass seem longer than it actually is. When it was dry, I vacuumed off the excess to make sure the track was clear of stray grass fibres. Black paint was then used on the edges of the base to make it blend in better with the black bottom of the display case I had. Whilst that is drying, I cut a rectangle of black card to the size of the inside rear wall of the case. I thought it would be nice to add a back scene, so I cut out part of a printed Gauge Master back scene to fit the card. It was then glued to the card using this general purpose glue. This would make it a bit more rigid, but also hide the white backing of the back scene. It can then be slid inside the case, and it actually fits perfectly and stays in place due to friction. And with that, let's assemble the finished display. First, the plastic base, then the diorama. The loco is carefully placed on the track, and then the top with the back scene is added. And that's it! Well, almost. I thought a nameplate was needed, so I 3D printed one. I painted it black and filled the text with white oil paint. It was then glued to the centre of the front of the display base. And now, I'm calling this project done. I actually built this as a commission project for a friend, and they seemed really pleased when they received it. I did have plans to do loads more with this model, like getting the lights to work, but I think given the severity of the corroded chassis, it would be quite optimistic. I also thought about adding loads of details to the display base, like fences, telegraph poles, more figures, plants, and even animals. but looking at it now, I think that it would have made it far too busy and detracted from the centrepiece that is the locomotive. After all, having brought out all of those details and then no one being able to see them because of other things being in the way, kind of defeats the point, right? Ultimately though, I hope that this has given an old model a new lease of life and will bring joy to its new owners. What do you think of my finished display, and is it something you'd consider doing for yourself? Let me know down in the comments. As always, shout out to my patrons on Patreon and channel members here on YouTube for the extra support they give my channel. Check the links in the description for more information. Alternatively, if you'd like to support my channel for free, click that subscribe button and turn notifications on so you never miss a modelling video. I'd like to extend my thanks to all those who provided some footage for use in this video, and you can find credits and connect with them using the links in the description. Finally, a massive thank you to you for watching this one, and I'll see you on the workbench again next time.